Operation Sea Lion was the name of the German plan for the invasion of Britain. The first phase of the strategy was for the Luftwaffe to gain command of the air through the destruction of the British fighter force and to close the channel to shipping. Once command of the air was gained, the full land invasion would begin. Standing in the way were some 750 operational fighters of Fighter Command, around 2/3 of them Hurricanes and 1/3 Spitfires. Against these were ranged the forces of the Luftwaffe with over 2,000 fighters and bombers. German pilots were confident of victory, having just swept all before them in Europe. However, other factors now came into play to the advantage of Fighter Command. The Luftwaffe would now be fighting over enemy territory with limited time in British airspace. Britain could also use its air defence system, a newly developed chain of radar stations which could detect incoming aircraft across the sea. Inland, information on enemy aircraft movements was collected by the Royal Observer Corps, and the information from these two sources was then relayed to Bentley Priory. Bentley Priory was Fighter Command's HQ near Stanmore, and the centre of Dowding's control system. It gave Fighter Command accurate information about the enemy's movements and a comprehensive visual picture of the battle. From Bentley Priory, information would be relayed to various sector stations and airfields which would scramble the fighters into the air. Such was the efficiency of the Dowding system that it took just 6 minutes on average between detecting enemy aircraft and scrambling the interceptors. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940, with the Luftwaffe concentrating its attacks on channel shipping and coastal defences. The German strategy was to draw Fighter Command into battle and overwhelm them with greater numbers. The raids were led by bombers, with fighters flying above them in support. The Spitfires were given the task of dealing with the fighters, and the Hurricanes with the bombers, which were the key targets for the RAF. It was the success of the Spitfire in dogfights with the German fighters that made it famous, but in the teeth of the Luftwaffe onslaught, RAF pilots began to appreciate just how good the Hurricane was too. In dogfights with the faster 109s, the Hurricane provided a steady gun platform and revealed an attribute that gave it a crucial advantage. It was always able to outmaneuver the Messerschmitt by flying a tighter turning circle. The German assault over the Channel was not effective, and in this first phase of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe lost some 286 aircraft to the 150 of Fighter Command. So on August the 13th, known as Eagle Day, Goering changed his strategy to attacks on the airfields, factories and ground installations, hoping to knock out the RAF's infrastructure. All the famous airfields were attacked: Kenley, Biggin Hill, Tangmere, North Weald and others, so putting enormous pressure on Fighter Command's operation. Goering changed tactics once again on August the 19th, ordering his fighters to fly closer in escort to his bomber formations. This meant that German fighters would lose the advantages of height and speed. Fighter Command now employed the tactic of attacking the German bomber formations head-on, a move which required nerves of steel from the pilots. This was done to break up the bomber formations before moving in to attack individual aircraft. In this phase of the conflict, the Hurricanes revealed other advantages over the more advanced Spitfire. The Hurricane's airframe, based on the Cam-Sigris structure, gave it a robustness which allowed it to keep on flying even when badly damaged. With its fuselage covered in fabric, a battle-damaged Hurricane could often be made operational again with just a piece of linen. A damaged Spitfire had to go back to the workshops to have metal patches riveted on. The wide undercarriage of the Hurricane enabled it to land and take off from uneven ground. vital as airfields became pitted with craters. Pilots on occasions were able to land and take off Hurricanes from fields. It became a war of attrition, and in the second half of August the Luftwaffe lost 435 aircraft to Fighter Command's 261. RAF pilots were exhausted and had a life expectancy of just 2 weeks. New recruits were rushed through, and the Hurricane, with its easier handling than the Spitfire, allowed the gaps to be filled quickly. As his bomber losses became unsustainable, Goering changed the focus of his attack again on September the 7th to London. This was partly in retaliation for a British bombing raid on Berlin, and partly in the belief that RAF fighters would be scrambled in force to protect the capital, making them easier targets. It was a strategic mistake, and in many ways the turning point of the battle. It allowed the damaged airfields to be patched up and radar installations to be repaired. More pilots were trained, and new aircraft arrived from the factories to bring the squadrons up to complement. The new German tactic signalled to Fighter Command the intended target, and allowed larger numbers of fighters to be mobilised to face the threat. It also brought the German attackers into range of the squadrons based further north, who used the tactic of attacking in large formations, known as the Big Wing. On the 15th of September 1940, now known as Battle of Britain Day, 2 huge waves of German attacks were launched against London with the aim of landing a decisive knockout blow on the RAF, who Goering believed was on the edge of collapse. All available RAF aircraft were scrambled, and the German pilots were shocked by the number of British fighters flying to intercept them. In the battles and dogfights which followed, the RAF scored a decisive victory over the Luftwaffe, knocking out some 60 of their aircraft for the loss of 26 RAF fighters. It became clear to Hitler that the Luftwaffe had not gained air superiority, and he postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely, turning his focus to the invasion of Russia. The Battle of Britain was won, and against all the odds Britain had been saved from invasion. The myth of German invincibility was broken, and it enabled Britain to become the launch pad for the D-Day landings in 1944 and eventual victory in the war. The Hurricane and the Spitfire had forged a deadly partnership that the most powerful air force in the world could not defeat. But it was the Spitfire whose name became synonymous with the victory and which gained the subsequent glory, while the Hurricane became a forgotten fighter. Yet it was the Hurricane that had done most of the damage. Some 860 enemy aircraft had been destroyed by Hurricanes to some 485 by Spitfires, with the Hurricanes destroying more bombers and around the same number of fighters as the Spitfire. The Hurricane was responsible for some 64% of victories during the Battle of Britain, more than all other aircraft and ground defences put together. After the extraordinary courage of the fighter pilots and the leadership of Dowding and Churchill, the victory of the Battle of Britain was in large measure due to Sidney Cam's radical design and to Hawker's for producing the aircraft in sufficient numbers to enable the pilots to win the day. Certainly the papers in 1941 were in no doubt about the debt the nation owed to Sidney Cam. In later life he regretted that the urgency of putting the Hurricane into production had inhibited its potential for growth. "If we'd had more time," he said, "it would have been the greatest aircraft of all time. Yet, if we had not gone ahead, we should have had nothing when we went to war with Germany." By the end of the Battle of Britain, the Hurricane had reached the limit of its development as an interceptor fighter. There was more scope to develop the Spitfire post-1940, and this, combined with its undoubted glamour, led to a Spitfire elitism. Yet the war was far from over for the Hurricane. When nighttime bombing raids began, the Blitz, it was switched to night patrols. But without any airborne radar, the Hurricane was ill-suited to this role and struggled to achieve any success. At Hawker factories, Hurricane production continued, and the number of aircraft produced increased throughout the war, only tailing off in 1944. Sidney Cam recognised that unless changes were made, the Hurricane would soon become obsolescent, and with the backing of Lord Beaverbrook, new and more powerful versions were introduced. The Hurricane's thick wing, which Cam had regretted, now became a major asset, and enabled it to be loaded with a phenomenal range of weapons. So versatile was the Hurricane that the additional weight had a negligible effect on its handling. It was reinvented as a high-speed, low-level bomber and ground attack fighter. This ensured its operational life right until the end of World War II, and it made decisive contributions in many theatres. In the Battle of the Atlantic, fought to preserve Britain's vital shipping supply line with North America, Hurricanes were catapulted off the decks of merchant ships to combat long-range German Focke-Wulf Condor aircraft. The catafighters were able to counter the threat of the scourge of the Atlantic, as Churchill called the Condor, which bombed British ships and carried out reconnaissance for German U-boats. Hurricanes were converted for maritime use and served on carriers with the Fleet Air Arm until 1943. The Sea Hurricane had its greatest triumph in the Mediterranean when it defended Allied supply convoys to Malta from ferocious Luftwaffe attacks. Nearly 3,000 were sent to Russia as Churchill's instrument of British support for the Soviet Union in its titanic struggle against the Third Reich. Incorporated into the Red Air Force and flown by Russian pilots, they provided fighter escort for Russian bombers and survived Arctic conditions. In North Africa, Hurricanes played a major role in the campaign leading up to Field Marshal Montgomery's victory at El Alamein in 1942. Armed with anti-tank guns and known as tank busters, they were highly effective against the tanks and other ground targets of Rommel's army. After his victory, Montgomery paid tribute to the RAF, saying, "I don't suppose any army has ever been supported by such a magnificent striking force." In the final years of the war, the Hurricane played a decisive role in the Burma campaign and provided the final proof, if ever this were needed, of the excellence of the aircraft. It was the only fighter that could be kept flying during the monsoon, and having established air superiority was a crucial factor in preventing the Japanese advance on India. Production of the Hurricane went on until nearly the end of the war, with the last of the many completed at Langley in 1944. In all, nearly 15,000 Hurricanes were built by Hawker Aircraft, Gloucester Aircraft, Kankar in Canada, and a few by Austin Motors. The Hurricane was not a glamorous aircraft, but was decisive in almost all the conflicts in which it took part. It has come to be seen as an essentially British aircraft, evocative of the nation's wartime character, reliable, tough and solid, a tank as opposed to a Rolls-Royce. Yet undoubtedly the Battle of Britain was its finest hour. In the words of Eric Brown, a Battle of Britain pilot, "It was the aircraft for the right season. It came at a time when it literally saved the country. It was there. It was needed. and it performed magnificently.